Alright, so it's that time again when a new set comes out, and every time a new set comes out, I prepare for the pre-release by going over all of the instance spells with flash and mass removal spells in the set. This is a thing that I always did for myself even before I started streaming and making content, and I think it helps me a lot when a new set comes out to know what the available tricks are and what the wrath effects in the set, like what creatures they can sweep away if they have any limitations, and what their casting costs are, so that way I know when I'm vulnerable to a wrath or not. I think those are the two types of cards. The anything that can be played at instant speed and the wrath effects are the things that are most likely to cause you to lose a game you would otherwise win further down the line when you're more used to the set and you know what all of the cards in the set are. So I like to do this every single time a new set comes out. A lot of the mentality that helps you win the game is just being aware of these cards existing. I'm gonna finish up a lot of descriptions of these cards, or I have in the past with, so just be aware that this is in the set. Because awareness of the card in the set is what really helps you not lose to it when you didn't have to. So, we're gonna start with white, and we're just gonna go down the list. So that's nice and easy. I have a list off to the side where I've written down all of the names of the cards that fit those categories, because when I used to try to do this, like the first couple of sets where I tried to stream this, I would always miss at least one card. So, our first one up is Jumpscare. So, this is the one white power and toughness boosting trick. This one's a little on the potent side. Not as good as Crumb and Get It, but still pretty decent. So it gives the creature +2/+2, and it gains flying and becomes a horror enchantment creature in addition to its other types. So this is one that can push damage by having their creature fly before blockers are declared. It can also allow a player to block a flyer that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to, similar to High Stride giving +1/+3 and reach in the last set. This one's going to play out a lot like that in that context. Also, as a fun side note, it does turn the creature into an enchantment, and this is not limited to targeting your creatures, and there is a handful of enchantment removal in the set. So, if you have an enchantment removing spell, this can let you 2-for-1 yourself to kill a really powerful non-enchantment creature in the set. That's not going to come up very often, but it is a thing you can do. So yeah, this is your basic combat trick. As far as the power and toughness boost goes for white, +2/+2 is pretty normal for 1 mana. So just so that you're aware, it's a 1 mana trick. Sometimes it's a 2 mana trick and it does other things. This one, like I said, it feels a little pushed, not like Crumb and Get It pushed, but still in the same vein where it's doing a lot for 1 mana. But yeah, so that's going to be your 1 mana creature boosting combat trick in white, or your cheap one. In this case, it is a 1 mana trick. Next up is Seized from Slumber. QRS. Seized from Slumber. So it's white and 4 for an instant that can destroy a target creature, or for white and 1, you can destroy a tapped creature. So this is one of those ones that's going to effectively kill attacking creatures early on, but then can be upgraded to kill any creature later. So this is another variant that white gets pretty often, is the destroy a tapped creature, destroying an attacking or blocking creature, or deal some amount of damage to a creature that meets those traits. This one's a little more versatile in that later in the game you can just spend 5 to straight up murder a creature. But in the early game, understand that your creature might die just because it's attacking if it doesn't have vigilance. Also, it might be used to kill one of your survivors before they can trigger. Usually they'll be tapped because they are an attacking creature, but if you use one of the other effects in the set to tap your survivor, either main phase 1 or during combat, so that way you can get the post-combat trigger for it. They might also be able to reach out and kill your survivor with this card. So, again, like I've been saying, just be aware of it. So that way you know that if you're using your one thing, I think it's like Children of the Weed or Orphans of the Weed or something. It's a Children's of the Corn reference. Lets you tap your untapped creatures to do things. They are vulnerable to this at 2 mana, even though they didn't attack. Which normally, this type of white removal does need the creature to attack. So, this one can actually kill them if they become tapped for other reasons. Right next to it is Shardmaid's Rescue. This is another white combat trick that's giving a power and toughness boost. This one is an aura, though, so this can trigger any of the Eerie mechanics. So the Eerie mechanic functions exactly like Constellation from Theros, except that it also triggers when you unlock the other half of a room. So the room coming in automatically triggers it because it's an enchantment, but when you pay the mana to unlock the other room on the 2 room cards, they also get a bonus based on whatever their Eerie thing is, and the Eerie can be anything, just like Constellation. It can be like draw a card, or deal damage, or buff a creature, or this gains flying until end of turn, like anything along those lines. So whatever your opponent's Eerie cards in play are, this can trigger them at instant speed. So those become onboard tricks if you know what the flash enchantments are. So be aware of that also. This one gives the creature +1/+1, and that's a permanent buff as long as the aura is attached to them. So if it wins combat, the creature is permanently augmented after this. It also grants hexproof, which means it can dodge a removal spell this way. So that's going to be the biggest thing about it, is that it's a 1 mana dodge a targeted removal spell. But it can also just be used to win combat, similar to Shore Up, except that it's permanent. So that's going to be a thing. Also, like I said, it's triggering all of your Eerie stuff at instant speed, so you also have to be a little leery of that. Real quick, I'm just going to point this out since one of them is sitting here. If you're playing on Arena, and you know the Arena tells where the opponent randomly has priority when nothing is obviously giving it to them, not only can it be any of the tricks in the set, there is also a cycle of mono-colored basic land cycling creatures in this set. They all cost... I think they all cost 6 mana. They definitely all cost 2 mana to cycle for the basic land that they represent. So the white one can plain cycle, the black one can swamp cycle, and so on. So this might be the thing that's giving them priority if they're not doing anything. So that's just another thing when you're playing on Arena to be aware of. In real life, opponents can be like, hang on a second, for any reason, but not a lot of people put their thing in full control on Arena for, anything less than, like, the major events. Split Up is one of the mono-white wraths. There's technically another one. It's part of a multicolored set of rooms, but you can always cast the one for just white. So that one can also be in a white deck, even if they don't have the other color. I believe it's a blue room on the other side. So Split Up is one of the 2 castable mono-white wraths. So it allows the caster to choose to destroy all tapped creatures or all untapped creatures. This one is particularly brutal. First of all, it only costs 3 mana, which most wraths cost 4 mana or more. So this one's already a little on the undercosted side. Also, the opponent gets to choose a mode to destroy creatures that meet that thing. So you run into the issue of, if you attack with all of your creatures, they can cast Split Up, assuming you don't have Vigilance creatures, they can cast Split Up and choose to destroy all tapped creatures on their turn after they've untapped, thereby killing your entire board and leaving them with all of their creatures alive. If you're not attacking with all of your creatures, they might be able to attack you, especially with their evasive creatures, and then choose to destroy all untapped creatures now that their creatures are tapped. You might still be able to eat some of their guys, but they have a much higher chance of having their things survive their own wrath at that point. If they like try and swarm you with a bunch of tapped creatures, you get to eat like 3 of them, but those were going to die if they chose untapped creatures anyway, and now they get to keep all of their tapped creatures, and you just lost all of your creatures. So the biggest problem with this thing is that you play around it by attacking with some of your creatures every turn. You know, if your best attackers are always tapped and your best blockers are always untapped, then the opponent has a lot worse choices with this card. Unfortunately, in best of one, it's going to be very hard to play around this, I feel like. But that is the best way to do it. The second best way is to have an indestructible trick or two, which I believe there's only the one green one that can do that. But if you have it and you can save one of your creatures and keep pressure on the opponent that way, you know, if you're attacking them with like a 5/5 trampler and they've got a bunch of like 1/1s and their plan is to kill your 5/5 trampler and then have the army of 1/1s that they can start attacking you with, and you save the 5/5, that'll get you out of it. But if you're attacking with a bunch of like 2/2 flyers and they have like a 5/5 untapped and they're just like, okay, I'm going to kill your stuff, and you save one of your 2/2 flyers, the 5/5 still might be able to race you down to the last life point, so it's going to be rough. Split up is actually pretty brutal because the opponent gets to choose and they have a decent amount of control over what's going to die because of that. It's going to be very difficult to get into a position where their guys can attack profitably and you have too many untapped creatures, but you also have an evasive threat that's killing them or a large creature that's killing them, so they have to decide if they want to just kill that one thing or kill all of their creatures and all of yours, basically, by choosing untapped without being able to attack profitably first. Yeah, it's still going to be a brutal card. I think this might be the most brutal thing to play against in the set. We'll have to see, but this feels like out of all of the Wraths and instant speed cards, this is going to be the most brutal one, just because of the versatility on it. Alright, that brings us to the Wandering Rescuer. So, the Wanderer is one of the many desparked planeswalkers, and now she is just a creature, and boy howdy is she a creature. This thing is going to be absolutely backbreaking and limited. So, she's 2 white and 3. For a 3/4, she has Flash, which is what gets her onto this list. She also has Convoke, which means you can tap untapped creatures you control to pay for her. She has Double Strike, so this is a flash creature with 3 power and Double Strike that can just come down in the middle of combat to block a creature and eat it. And other tapped creatures you control have Hexproof, which means that if you tap those, even if those creatures are untapped, if your opponent goes for a kill spell on one of them, and you can Convoke out the Wandering Emperor, even if you have the 5 mana, you can just tap the creature that they're targeting as one of the mana, and it can be part of the colorless cost too. It doesn't have to be a white creature to help pay for her. They can save their creature and deploy a very potent attacker / blocker. Yeah, the Wandering Rescuer is also going to be an incredibly brutal card. She is only 1 creature, and she does not protect herself, so she doesn't have hexproof while she's attacking the opponent, for example, or she becomes tapped for another reason. But she's still an absurdly powerful creature. This is going to ambush you a lot of the time. You have to treat her a lot like you treated the Moose in Bloomburrow, except that she's a mythic rare, so it's a lot less likely that the opponent will randomly have her. Like, the Moose was an uncommon, so if your opponent just left 6 mana up, you're like, okay, cool. They have the Moose. But it's going to be a lot harder to go, oh, my opponent has 5 mana, or, 3 mana and 2 untapped creatures. That's the other thing. It's like, you gotta do math on this one based on their untapped creatures, whether or not they could cast her. If you're doing best of 1, or if you haven't seen her in any of the games yet, in best of 3. Yeah, Wandering Emperor, you can be aware of her, but that's not going to help much. She's going to ambush you at some point in time, and she's probably going to kill one of your better creatures, and then be a very dangerous attacker after that. So again, this just becomes being aware of her, and if you can win the game without making your stuff vulnerable to her, or if, you know, if she suddenly showed up, you would lose the game that you were about to win, you can change your strategy up a little bit. You know, her suddenly coming down, eating one of your creatures, and you no longer have lethal, and then attacking you back for lethal because they didn't have to lose all of their stuff or die, is probably going to be a factor that you need to consider. If you can still win the game if they don't have the Wandering Emperor. You know, if you can win the game through the Wandering Emperor, then being aware of her existence allows you to do that. Whereas if you can't beat the Wandering Emperor anyway, you just kind of have to stumble into her and hope it's not her because she's a mythic. And our last white card is Unwanted Remake, which I feel like the name is a jab at the Hollywood movie industry in general and the occasional unnecessary horror movie remake in particular. So this is white, destroy target creature. It does other stuff, it does have a drawback, and it's not an exile effect, but it's very close to a sword/path, in that it's going to kill the creature for 1 mana. The fact that they get a replacement creature is relevant. That's a lot more relevant than a tapped land, and certainly more relevant than life a lot of the time. Sometimes the tapped land is more relevant if it's in the early game. You know, replacing their creature with a different 2/2 and giving them is a lot better than giving them a land, but in the mid to late game, it's probably better to just give them the land. So this is still a 1 mana destroy a creature trick, which means it's very efficient. It's not good for getting a blocker out of the way so you can attack for lethal unless you're killing a flyer or something, or a reach creature. But it's still going to be a 1 mana kill a creature and replace it with a 2/2 most of the time. They do get to look, though. We'll have to see how Manifest Dread plays out. They do have a higher chance of getting a creature, which they can later pay to turn face up. So you might still be giving them something really good with this. I have to believe, though, that this card is still going to see some amount of play. I don't know if it's going to be tier 1 removal, like you should always take this, or if it's going to be like the you need removal, it's better than nothing, you have to take it type of thing. At 1 mana, I see it trending towards the should be taking it highly, despite the fact that it gives the player a replacement creature. But it is a card that only costs 1 mana and destroys a creature, which means its potential for 2-for-1 blowouts against some of the other ways to protect creatures while augmenting them in combat. There's an indestructible Death Touch trick on the list. There's the Hexproof and +1/+1 if they go for it before damage, and you get to kill their guy instead. There's also a +2/+2 and Trample Aura with Flash, which those things always get me when they're in the format and somebody's running them. They are my least favorite combat tricks to play against, are the ones that permanently augment the creature significantly. So yeah, this is another one. People are definitely going to be trying this the first week or two, even if it's not good. So you will be playing against this, so you need to know that your opponent can kill your creature for 1 mana at instant speed. And while you will get a replacement creature, the initial creature will almost definitely be a downgrade, and whether or not you can manifest something that you then have to pay for to turn face up to get the full effect of the body on the board. It might give you the card, but you still have to pay for it. Similar to if it exiled the card from the top of your deck and you could cast it. And it denies comes into play abilities on the creature, so that's another factor. Like, even if you give your opponent something, if its strength was in its ability to come into play and do a thing, they're at least denied that. So alright, so that's going to bring us to blue now, and our first blue card is Don't Make a Sound. So, we're going to go over this right now. The way you play around counterspells is, first you have to be aware of what their casting costs are, so that you know whether or not your opponent has one that they could be holding up. The way you play around counterspells is, you either don't play anything into them if you can help it. That way, they waste their mana. Or you play the least effective card that you have, as long as you have other cards to follow that up with. Because if they don't play their counterspell when they can, then they've wasted their mana and you're still developing out to the board. Like, if you have a very powerful, rare, like, 2 or 3 mana creature, and an okay 2 or 3 mana creature, and they're holding up 2 mana, one of it blue, your options are to either wait until you can pay the extra mana that this spell requires, or cast your worst of your 2 cards out, so that way they will counter that one. And if they don't, then you've developed out to the board, and now they have to keep holding up 2 mana waiting for your other better spell. And that's going to eat into the amount of mana they can use on their turns to cast things. Excuse me. So, that is how you play around counterspells. You either make them waste the mana, or you give them the worst target. Usually it's better to make them waste the mana if you can help it. If you have anything you can do at instant speed, especially flash creatures or other things, so that way you can develop out your board at the end of their turn and make them have to leave up their mana on your turn and then their turn again, and then spend it at the end of their turn, and now you're free to cast your other spells if they want to use their counterspell then. Basically, you have to tax their mana or make them use the card suboptimally, and that is the way all counterspells work. Blue does have a lot of flash cards in this set, like a higher ratio than normal, so they might have other things to do with their mana if you don't make them use it, which is always a bit of a problem. Like, if you don't spend your mana and they can still spend their mana on other things, that starts to become a bit of an issue, so be aware of that. But the way you play around counterspells is that you try to make them waste the mana as often as possible, or waste the card on a suboptimal spell. Much like, baiting their removal spell with an okay creature, and then you play your better creature. It works the same way with counterspells, except that you can waste their time and mana and make them play less efficiently. 1 second. Alright, hopefully we cleared that up. There are going to be a couple more counterspells on the list. I know there's at least one. I think there's 2. Alright, our next one is Enduring Curiosity. So this is one of the many flash creatures I was talking about. Like an above average number, at least. I feel like there's usually only 1 or 2, and this set has like 3, I think. Maybe it does only have 1 or 2. No, wait, Fear of Impostors is a creature. So it has 3. So, Enduring Curiosity is a 4-mana 4/3 with flash. When a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. And it is part of a rare cycle where if it dies and it was a creature at the time, it will return as a non-creature enchantment. So, Enduring Curiosity is already a 4/3 that can jump out of nowhere and eat your 2/2 or your 2/3 that's attacking them. But it can also come down after blocks before damage is dealt in order to draw cards. Like, that's part of the design, is it's meant to be, oh, you didn't block? Well, here's my 4/3 now. So while you were playing around other combat tricks, boosting their creatures and killing your guys in combat, their real surprise was that, no, they just wanted to draw some cards. Or worse, they had both. And if you had it blocked, you would have lost your guy, but because you didn't block, you're going to give them cards instead. So, this is another one where you just kind of have to know it's in the set and be aware of it, because it will occasionally just randomly eat your guy or draw them a bunch of cards. Or just draw them 1 or 2 cards, like they attack with their evasive creatures and they flash it in after you don't block with your, like, their flyer attacks, and you're like, I don't want to trade flyers. And then this thing shows up and it's like, I kind of wish I had traded flyers now, because now they got to draw a card and I can't attack with my flyer because then they'll just draw another card next turn. So, yeah. Alright, Entity Tracker. So this is the only creature with Flash that has Eerie on it. There are very, very few Flash enchantments in the set, and there are more than usual, obviously, because the set relies on enchantments to trigger things, so they have to have a handful of them that have Flash in place of regular instants, but there's still only a handful of them. And its thing is drawing you a card, so you really don't have to worry about it, the Eerie aspect of it. Like, they suddenly have a creature with Eerie, and now they have a Flash enchantment also. That being said, it is still a 3-mana 2/3 that can come down out of nowhere and eat your creature. It can also be what they cast when you don't give them a target for their 2-drop counterspell. You know, they don't have a target for it on turn 2, so on turn 3 they play their land and pass, and you're like, okay, I'm going to keep making them waste their mana on their counterspells, and then they flash this thing in instead. So that is a factor. Like I said, they have a few more flash cards than normal that they could be running. It is a rare, though, so that's not going to happen too often. But it's a 2/3 that can come out of nowhere and eat like your 2/2 attacker. So we have 2 different things that can come out of nowhere and eat like your 2/2 that's attacking them, that are both rares. Alright, next up is Fear of Impostors. So this is a 3-mana 3/2. It's an enchantment creature, so this is one of the few enchantments with Flash in the set. So when it enters, it counters target spell, and that spell's controller manifests dread. So you usually don't want to use this on, like, low impact spells. You might just flash it in as a 3/2 and trade with a creature in combat, or at the end of their turn and then attack with your 3/2 on your turn. Those scenarios seem a lot more likely. But you do have to worry that in the mid to late game, when you go for your game-ending spell, that this is one of the counter spells you have to be aware of in the set. So yeah, this is one of the 3 counter spells, and it can hit anything. It does cost cancel mana, but it also leaves behind a 3/2 body that can then rumble with the 2/2 body that it's giving you to replace your spell, which is probably way worse than the spell you were casting in a lot of scenarios. Like I said, if they're actually using it to counter the spell, a random 2/2 that could even turn into another creature in your deck is probably still worse than the spell, especially since you have to pay to turn it into the other creature. So yeah, this is another one of the counter spells, and this is one of the ones where if you don't give them a reason to cast it, they might just run it out anyway, because it's a 3/2 creature for 3, and that can do some damage in the mid to early game. So they don't just want to sit on it and not develop out their board. Speaking of developing out the board, we have another creature with Flash. So this is Floodpit's Drowner. It's a 2-mana 2/1. It also has Vigilance. Weird, but we'll get to why in a minute. So when it enters, it taps target creature an opponent controls and puts a stun counter on that creature. And then the other relevant aspect of it is it has blue 1 and tap, shuffle Floodpit's Drowner and target creature with a stun counter on it into their owner's libraries. So what this thing can do is it can come down, stun one of your opponent's creatures, attack them for 2 if they don't have any good blockers with Vigilance, and then activate its ability to shuffle itself and the stunned creature back into the opponent's deck before they get to untap with it. So it's a very weird creature removal spell that can sometimes attack for damage. It's a very aggressive blue creature removal spell, which is kind of surprising. It locks down the creature. It's only 2 mana, by the way, for all of this. Like, it still comes down, like, they play their 2-drop, like, you if you're on the play, you pass on turn 2, they play their 2-drop, you flash this in, tap their dude, attack them for 2 on your next turn, and then get to decide if you want to hold up mana for one of your other things, and then possibly shuffle their guy back in, because they're going to lose the stun counter first. So their guy is still going to be tapped, so you still might get an attack in with this thing next turn, depending on if they have a 2 or 3 mana play on turn 3. It's a very aggressive creature removal spell for blue, and then it's giving up your creature to give up their creature to shuffle it back in. And later in the game, when this thing is locking down some potentially... Oh, right, you do have to do it before the stun counter. I'm sorry, it's not a tapped creature, it's a creature with a stun counter on, so you do have to decide before the stun counter comes off if you're shuffling it back in. That's my bad. It does require that the stun counter still be on it. But this thing can actually make their large, dangerous creature wander off on them. So... yeah, this thing can suddenly spring out and trade for something just off of its own mana. It can also, if it needs to, like, it can tap down one creature that they were planning on blocking with while also blocking an attacking creature. You know, if they're holding back their, like, medium-sized flyer to hold off your flyers, and attacking on the ground with their creatures that would trade with your flyers if you block, you might be in the mode where you tap their creature and might have to block their guy. So that's a thing. Yeah, this thing has a lot of play to it with what it can do. As far as it can be a creature removal spell, it can be a tempo play that gets in for damage. It can be both sometimes. So, again, you just have to be aware of what the opponent's options are in order to know what they can possibly do to mess us up. So this thing coming down post-combat to tap the blocker that you left back is also a factor. You know, they don't have to stop you from attacking with your guys. They can do it preemptively to prevent blocking after you've committed your other creatures to attacking. You know, they wait and see. Because if you're not going to attack with everything because you're dead on the crackback, and you only leave back the wrong number of creatures when this thing's in their hand... so you do have to be aware that you might have one less blocker than you thought you were going to have. And they might have one more attacker than you thought on top of that. Next up is Get Out. So this is a counter spell that can counter a creature or enchantment for 2 blue. So there's that. It also has another mode where it can return 1 or 2 target creatures and or enchantments that the caster owns to their hand. So there aren't a lot of steal effects. I know there's one. There might be a second one that I missed in red. But there is like 1 blue enchantment that can steal a creature. So most of the time this is going to be a way to save their thing from your removal spell. If they can't counter, if your removal spell is not attached to a creature or an enchantment, they can't just counter your instant or sorcery speed removal spell. So they have to go for the saving their creature. But it is a thing that they can do with this. They can also use it to reset rooms or to bounce creatures with comes into play abilities or enchantments. So ideally you want them to do that. You want them to negative tempo themselves to try and get long-term value with this card. But in order to do that, you have to be in a position where you can pass when they're leaving up the mana for it. And even then, they might not use it for that. They have to have good targets. But you're still wasting their mana each turn that they try and leave this up in order to counter your stuff. So, same way you play around the other counter spells. The only difference is this one can always counter your spell, and there's no getting to 2 extra mana in order to play around it. Next up is Glimmer Burst. So normally card draw, you just have to be aware that there's card draw in the set because the opponent can do that. Either instead of, if you don't cast your spell and they have the counter spell in hand, they also might have a card draw spell they can spend their mana on instead. This one, though, comes with a twist in that it also makes a 1/1 creature. That's an enchantment. So it is a way to trigger Eerie at instant speed, and a way to put a random 1/1 body onto the table. So That can trade with your X1s. It can chump block your large non-trampling creatures. It doesn't fly. The Glimmers aren't flying enchantment creatures, but it can still block a large ground creature. So that can throw off combat math by a lot. It can also randomly just make them a 1/1 at the end of your turn in addition to the card draw, so now they have an extra attacker, which if you're getting low on life, that will go from, yeah, it's just a 1/1 to, that's actually a problem, and that will kill me in a turn or two. So, or I will die because of it now, because they have an extra attacker, and that's the last point of damage. So, again, it's just being aware of it, but normally card draw spells, you only need to be aware of them because they're what your opponent could be holding on to for arena tells, or what they can do instead if you don't give them a target for their counterspell. But the fact that this one deploys even a 1/1 body is still that much more relevant than it normally would be. It is a 4-drop, so it might not play particularly well in the set, but some players are going to run it because they need some card draw, and it does develop to the board in the slightest way possible, but, you know, that's more relevant than most card draw spells. It's a lot better than paying 4 mana and drawing 2 cards and not getting anything on board that you can attack and block with. So, you are going to see this card especially early on until we decide if it's a good card in the set or not. Those Glimmer Burst. Next one is Twist Reality. Twist Reality. 2 blue and 1, so another cancel. Similar to the Fear of Impostors, this is a straight-up counter-target spell. This one is more easily used on earlier plays, like if the opponent doesn't have a 3-drop creature and they want to hold up their mana. Like, this one's much better if they need to counter your spell, and much worse if you don't give them a spell to counter, because they can't just deploy a 3/2 to make up for it. They can deploy a 2/2, though, because it does have the option to manifest Dread. So if they really feel like they can't hold on to the counterspell and keep holding up mana, they will probably use this if you don't give them a good target. So in a lot of ways, it's worse than the Fear of Impostors if you have to use it as the creature only, and better if you have to use it as a counterspell because it's not giving them anything. Although, you're also not getting a 3/2 out of it, so... Anyway, this is the common, the other one's the uncommon, so I guess we know which one Wizards thinks is a lot more powerful. But yeah, this is another 3-mana counterspell. So there's 2 3-mana counterspells, a 2-mana hard counter for creatures and enchantments, and a 2-mana soft counter for anything unless the caster pays 2. So there are a lot of different counterspells in this set, and a bunch of other flash creatures, and 2 of the counterspells are also flash creatures, so it gives the opponent a lot more to do with their mana if you don't play into the counterspell. But the problem with that is that playing into the counterspell lets them use their card and their mana efficiently, so you're going to have to balance that out. Like I said, if you can deploy a less frightening creature or other valid target for their counterspells first, and get them to use it on the inferior card, that's probably going to do you a lot better. But if you can't do that, then sometimes it's better to just either make them waste the mana or make them play out their thing as a creature rather than a counterspell. Because a 2/2 manifested or a 3/2 just straight up on the board is probably not as problematic as losing like your 5-drop, rare creature or something. If you can afford to. You always have to be aware of, can I wait around if they have, can I play around the counterspell, or am I just falling further and further behind by me not using my mana efficiently? Like, you don't want to overreact to the counterspells and not do anything and be like, oh good, I'm making them waste their mana, because eventually they will draw a flash card or be able to cast their spell and hold up their counterspell at the same time. So you can't just sit around and do nothing all the time, but you can occasionally sit around and do nothing when you have board position, or when doing so will waste their time more than it wastes your time, basically. If you're not deploying your 2-drop because they're representing a counter spell, and you can wait until you can, play 2-2-drops on turn 4 instead, and then even if they have the counter spell, they're not stopping you from developing out to the board, that's probably fine, but you don't want to sit there and go, well, I didn't play my 2-2, and now I'm not playing my my 3-drop on turn 3 or my 2-drop on turn 3, and I'm not going to have the double spell option on turn 4 unless I top deck. Yeah, don't let yourself get backed into that corner by overdoing it. Alright, we got one last blue spell, and it's Vanish from Sight. So, blue and 3, target permanent's owner puts it on top or bottom of their library, and you surveil 1. So, this is a very common blue removal spell. It gives the opponent the option to redraw it, but it does make them give up an actual draw. Like, they've spent their mana on their spell, and you spent your mana on this spell, and you're down that card, but now your opponent, instead of drawing a new spell, has to redraw a spell they've already drawn. So it's net neutral on cards. Or they put it on the bottom, in which case you have spent your spell, and now their spell is gone. So they do get to draw new cards after that, but they don't have the card that they already spent mana on and had in play originally. So either way, you're still net neutral on cards with these things. This is the blue spell that can make your guy suddenly wander off in the middle of combat. Or when you go for that punch with your green spell, and you're going to try and knock out their creature. This is the thing that can interfere with that by having your creature suddenly not be there. So that's a pretty common thing with blue's removal, is that it's very tempo-y, and this is their big tempo play of the set, to have the creature wander off. But it does cost 4 mana. Gives a surveil, though, and surveil can be close to drawing a card in the mid to late game when you're going to be casting this thing anyway. So, yeah, another thing to just be aware of, it does cost 4 mana, so it's not as likely to come up as the 3 or 2 mana ones that sometimes crop up. But usually it's not 2 mana because you're getting your card's worth of value back out of it. If it's 2 mana, it usually has a lot of restrictions on it or something, or some other negative aspect to it. But 3 mana does show up from time to time. So, this time it's going to be 4 mana, though. Alright, that brings us to black. So our very first black card has Flash. It's a 3 mana 3/2, so it's not likely to eat one of your creatures unless you're attacking with a 1/2 or a 1/3, or some small actual 1/1 creature. Which is entirely possible, but if your opponent's not doing anything on turn 3, and they're vulnerable, you need to be a little leery of this thing. But it is also likely to just come down and trade with a 2 or 3 toughness creature. You attack with your 2/3, you flash in your 2/3 that can draw cards when you cast enchantments, and then you attack with your 2/3 because it looks like the way is clear, and then they flash this thing in. It's that's not good. But yeah, that is its main thing. It does also have, when it attacks, it allows the controller to surveil 1. So that is also relevant, that it might come down end of your turn instead of trading with your guy, so it can get an attack in, trying to set up Delirium by being able to mill cards. But you do need to be aware of it because it can just randomly show up and eat or trade with one of your much better creatures that you really didn't want to have die here. So, another thing to be aware of. Next, we have to go all the way down to the G's for given to violence. So, this is kind of odd in this set. It's +2/+2 and lifelink to a creature, and that's all it is. I think its main focus... I'm sorry about that. Its main focus is that it's an instant for your Delirium. But past that, black usually doesn't get combat tricks like this. Black will way more likely get creature gets +2/+0 and lifelink, and if it would die this turn, return it to the battlefield, or gets +2/+0 lifelink and indestructible. It usually doesn't get, like, just a toughness boost. It's kind of weird to see this in black, honestly, because of that. Like, normally when black gains toughness, it gets, like, a small power boost or something and gains death touch at that point instead. So seeing it just straight up give a creature +2/+2 is very uncharacteristic for black. That being said, it functions like this trick normally does in your white decks in past sets, where it's like 2 mana, it gives the creature +2/+2 and lifelink until end of turn, so it throws off combat math a lot when the race is tight, because now their creature isn't dying, and they're gaining life, and not only are they gaining life, they're gaining 2 more life than its power originally was, so this can really throw off a close race, so you definitely need to be aware of this one. This is the one where it's like, okay, what is the most likely thing they could have that would screw up my combat math and allow them to actually live through this turn? This is probably the go-to one, because it's going to gain them most likely like 4 to 6 life, and allow their creature to live, and allow it to eat your guy rather than trade or chump it. So this is one of the ones that you most need to be aware of, I think, if you're going to be in a tight race with the opponent. Like, how do they live this turn? This is how they live and how they turn the game around. This is going to be one of those combat tricks where you know it exists and you can play around it, but when you don't know it exists, it will absolutely ruin you in a lot of games. Like, their guy not dying, and them gaining life, and them having a good attack now next turn probably is going to be more than you can handle if you don't know that that's a possibility. Next up is Live or Die. So there's a handful of instant speed removal spells in this set in black that can just straight up kill a creature. This one is the scariest one. It is the most expensive, so you'll be able to know when it's potentially coming, but that's not going to help as much. So, at its worst, this is going to be destroy target creature for 5 mana at instant speed. That's what you kind of have to hope for in most cases, is that that's what it's going to be. Because the other option is a lot worse for you. So the other option is to return target creature from the caster's graveyard to the battlefield. So if their creatures are bad, and they can't ambush your guy and eat your guy with this thing, and then have a creature on the battlefield to attack you with, they're just going to kill your creature. That's what I mean when I say the best case scenario for you is that the opponent has to destroy one of your creatures with this thing. The worst case scenario is that they have a very powerful creature in the graveyard, and when you attack into them, instead of it just being a removal spell to kill your guy, it's going to be get their giant guy back and eat your guy. This plays a lot like the Moose once they have a good creature in the graveyard, and the rest of the time it plays like an overcosted murder. So you do have to be aware of this one, and be aware of what's in their graveyard if they're playing black, because normally black instants that return creatures from the graveyard to the battlefield nowadays either have a bunch of hoops to jump through in order for it to be an instant speed revival spell, or do something like return the creature to the battlefield tapped, or make it unable to block somehow. Like, they don't normally let you ambush your opponent with your best creature from your graveyard. This one does, and so you have to be aware of it, and when they're playing black, you have to be aware of what's in their graveyard before you attack, so that way you know if their best case scenario is to kill your guy rather than to bring back their guy and still kill your guy. Oh, that's true. I don't have the Meathook Massacre 2. It's not a full-on Wrath, but it is a very brutal card, so I suppose we should go over it, because it can kill a large number of creatures. Granted, killing 3 creatures requires 10 mana, so that's unlikely, but it can still kill 2 creatures pretty easily. Right, 2 creatures is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, that's, I think, the top end of what it can kill, so just so that you're aware. When it comes into play, each player sacrifices X creatures, so it's 4 black and 2 X. So 4 black and 2 makes everybody lose a creature. 4 black and 4 makes everybody lose 2 creatures. Past that is unlikely, but not impossible. But it also has the abilities when a creature the caster controls dies, and this is an enchantment, so it sticks around and keeps doing this. They can pay 3 life to return it to the battlefield with a finality counter. Whenever your creatures die, the caster will get the creatures back unless you pay 3 life. And if you don't pay the 3 life, they get the creature with a finality counter on it. So, even if it only kills your one creature, if it's not a token, you have to either lose 3 life or give them that creature. And whatever they choose to lose, if it has like a good comes into play ability, or if they just want it back on the battlefield because it's threatening your life total, they can pay 3 life and have it back. So, it is a very hard card to cast at 4 black. If you're not, nearly mono black, even with the incredibly high casting cost of like 4 black and 2 to get 1 creature and 4 black and 4 to get 2 creatures, that's still going to be a little bit difficult for decks that aren't very heavy black or don't have a bunch of the black dual lands from the set to pull off. But it is something that can happen where suddenly your creatures are going to die and you're either going to have to give them to your opponent or lose a bunch of life. So, yeah, it's not a full-on wrath, but killing 2 creatures with this thing is not unreasonable, and that can feel like a wrath a lot of the time when your opponent gets those creatures, or you're losing a ton of life to this thing. So, we'll just call it out while we're here. Alright, so from Live and Die, we come to Murder, which is 2 mana less, and doesn't give you the option to reanimate a creature. It's still a removal spell, and it's one of the better ones in the set. 3 mana, kill a creature is one of the most efficient removal spells, and everything that's more efficient than that either can't hit any creature or gives the opponent something back in return. So, just know that on 3 mana, your opponent can straight up kill a creature. Nowhere to Run is interesting. First of all, it's funny because this is the hard counter to the Wanderer. It removes Vigilance and Ward. It allows you to target, or not Vigilance and Ward, Hexproof and Ward as though they didn't have those abilities. So it will get around the Wanderer's ability to protect your creatures. And it will also give the Wanderer -3/-3, which will drop her down to an 0/1, so if she's blocking, you can actually potentially kill her anyway in combat. That being said, you're probably most likely going to use this to just kill their 2 or 3 drop creature, but the fact that it gets around her is a little added bonus. It also gets around anything else in the set with Hexproof or Ward. And it does work with itself. Since it has to come into play in order for this ability to trigger, the other effect will be active at the time that you're choosing targets for it. So, but yeah, it's just another creature kill spell that can only hit creatures with 3 or less toughness if it's going to straight up kill them, and can weaken a creature in combat so that it can be killed if it has more toughness than that, possibly without losing the creature that you got into combat with. So, after Nowhere to Run, have Winter's Intervention. So, black and 1 deals 2 damage to target creature and you gain 2 life. Kills a little creature, finishes off a larger creature, but that's a 2-for-1, and gains the caster 2 life. This can throw off combat math if the race is really close. If you were just barely going to kill them, losing your creature and them gaining 2 life probably seals the deal in their favor now, or at least guarantees that they're going to live through the turn and gives them a chance to still win the game, depending on how close the race actually was. And it just straight up kills like 2 toughness creatures all day long and gains them 2 life. You're going to see this card a lot. Very similar to Saver. You're going to see this one a lot because it's going to kill little creatures and gain them life. It's not as good as Saver, both because it's gaining less life long term, and it's dealing 2 damage rather than giving -2/-2, so it does not let you win combats against like opponent's combat trick or something. But at least it makes it a 2-for-2 instead of them eating your guy. So there's that. And our last black card is Withering Torment. This is only the second card, I believe. Possibly the third. I think there might be a creature from like a commander set that can do it. Black card that can just straight up kill an enchantment with no strings attached. You lose 2 life, but that's negligible. It doesn't make them sacrifice it or require that they have like something else going on in order to kill the enchantment. So it can also kill a creature. But in this set, with all of the rooms and everything, and the other enchantment matters cards, there are going to be times where you're going to kill an enchantment with this thing. So be aware that your opponent in mono black or black red does have enchantment removal for your fancy room. Also, the rooms, when you try to unlock the other half of them, do have to be in play for that ability to happen. Like, if you kill the room in response, then there's no room to unlock anymore. So they won't get the effects of the other room if they pay to unlock it. So you can get a tempo hit in also with this. Very similar to, they spend mana on their creature, you know, like it's fire breathing or something, and then you kill it, and now they don't have the mana to do anything else. Same basic principle applies. So be aware that black does have a straight up kill an enchantment card in the set. It is an uncommon, and it does make them lose 2 life, but they do have that as an option. Alright, that brings us to red. First up is Betrayer's Bargain. So it's red and 1, but you either have to sacrifice a creature, sacrifice an enchantment, or pay 2 mana as an additional cost to cast it. So it's either a 4-drop or it needs to eat a creature or enchantment in order to be a 2-drop. It does 5 damage to target creature, and if that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. So it's either a very efficient burn spell, but it requires that you sacrifice something else, which red does have a sub-theme of sacrificing things for value in this set. Black-red is meant to sacrifice things for value, so there might be some things you can get rid of that don't hurt as much to lose. But most of the time this is going to be a 4-drop, and 5 damage, so it's just a removal spell that can only hit creatures in red. So there is a 6 damage burn spell also, because red gets those now in order to make sure it has answers to most of the like dragon caliber mythic creatures. But just be aware that your creature with 5 or less toughness is vulnerable to this thing, and might be vulnerable to this thing in the early game too. Like they might, if they have anything they can afford to throw away to 2-for-1 themselves, your like early high power toughness creature might not be as invulnerable as you think to red damage removal at that point. So next up is Impossible Inferno, which I believe is the 6 damage one. This one costs a bit more mana. There we go. Possible. So 5 mana, instant speed, deals 6 damage to target creature. If you have Delirium, you get to exile the top card of your deck and you can play it until the end of your next turn. So this is their other like high damage burn spell that can kill like a large green creature. This one does cost 5 mana though all of the time. So Betrayer's Bargain is how they would kill your thing that you ramped into really quickly. This is the one that they have to hope that they live long enough in order to cast, but it also might draw them a card. So just be aware that this is like their equivalent of black's normal 5 mana kill any creature spell. This is what red gets this time around. I think black made out really well in this particular bargain, what with it having a much better option, whereas red you need to have Delirium in order to get your card back on top of killing their guy. But alright, so as far as sweepers go, this is the one we have not had straight up Pyroclasm since I feel like 7th or 8th edition, something like that. So it's been a decade since we've had Pyroclasm in Standard. For those of you who don't know, Pyroclasm is the original spend mana, deal damage to each creature. In this case, it's red and 1 for a sorcery that deals 2. This is going to be a huge blowout against aggro decks in the format. If you remember the Wildfire Howl, where dealing 2 damage to like the mouse deck just basically ruined them, this costs 1 less mana, and you don't get the option to deal a point of damage to one of your opponent's 3 toughness guys in the exchange. I think it's okay. I think the fact that you're killing all of their 1 and 2 toughness creatures, and all of yours, and it does do the thing where if you can attack with your guys that are going to die anyway, and they block with their bigger creatures, it will wipe away their bigger creatures also if they get down to like 1 or 2 remaining toughness. So be aware of this when your opponent like throws a lot of their creatures at your better guys. It might legitimately be Pyroclasm. Like, they might not have good blocks, and at least attacking with their stuff means that if you block with the obvious creatures, you're going to lose your guys to the Pyroclasm, and that's fine. They traded their guys and some damage for all of your guys. Or, I'm sorry, they traded their guys for all of your guys and some damage, most likely. So, yeah, you do have to be aware of Pyroclasm. Like, that might be why they're attacking into your things. Like, it's not just one burn spell that's going to kill your best guy. It might be one burn spell that's going to kill all of your guys that would have survived otherwise, if you make the obvious blocks. So, in that regard, if you're blocking, because you have to avoid taking a lot of damage, it's best to block in the same way that you would for a gives all of your creatures +2 power type red effect, like all attacking creatures get +2 power. That sort of thing. Like, just assume that they can deal 2 more damage than it looks like they can on board, and you should be able to block safely. Also, keep in mind that if it's specifically this thing, you're going to be losing all of your little guys anyway, so it might be better to block with your little guys and trade than it is to block with your bigger guys. Alright, so that was Pyroclasm. That brings us to Scorching Dragonfire, which is a reprint. It deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and if that permanent would die, it gets exiled instead. Typical red burn spell. Plays like all of the other ones. So just be aware that it's a 2-mana one that deals 3 damage. This set. Next up is Turn Inside Out. So it's a single red to give a creature +3/+0, and if that creature dies this turn, you manifest Dread. So what this is when they attack their little guy into your medium guy, and they don't have like a good, we're gonna Pyroclasm the board if you block setup. It could just be this thing, which allows them to trade their little guy for your medium guy and still have a 2/2 that might even be a better creature underneath that they can pay for later. When you give your opponent a replacement manifest creature, it's usually worse for them because they still have to pay the mana to turn it into the better creature. With this one, you're trading your guy for a 2/2, and later on, if that 2/2 is a better creature, you can pay to turn it into another better creature, so it's more like a delayed draw at that point for you, is what you're getting out of it. By using your card to turn your guy into a manifest. And you're still killing their guy in this situation, so be aware of this thing. It's also +3 damage for 1 mana out of nowhere, so if they're attacking with a lot of creatures trying to swarm you, this could be where their last couple points of damage is coming from. So if you use your removal spell, like if you're not actually dead on board, but you're trying to save some life by using a removal spell, it might be that they can squeeze out the victory by suddenly giving one of their other guys +3 power. So now their 2 power guy dying isn't good enough anymore. So be aware of that. But, you know, I don't think there's a ton of burn that goes face. In fact, none of this burn goes face. So You do have the benefit of that. Like, none of the instant speed damage can go face. There's probably a sorcery speed thing that can deal damage to a player, but we'll have to find that one later on. So, yeah, watch out for this one because a lot of the burn is not going face, so they have to put the extra damage in combat in order to get it through. Alright, next up is Untimely Malfunction. So, they've been trying lately to make the more narrow effects be on more versatile cards. That's been a thing that they've been doing for a little over a year now, I think. Maybe closer to 2 years at this point. Definitely over a year. But I forget if it's been closer to 2 or closer to 1. Because of Arena and Best of 1, originally. Now also because of play boosters not having as many commons per set, so there's less room for a janky sideboard card in the formats for limited. So this is your destroy target artifact effect, but in addition to original shatter, you also get the ability to change the target of target spell or ability with a single target, or 1 or 2 target creatures can't block this turn. This might be one of the most crazy versatile red spells I've seen in a while. Destroying an artifact, you know, sometimes you just need to. There are several artifact creatures in this set because of Delirium. So this can kill creatures on occasion. There's not a ton of them, like most of them are enchantment creatures, but there are a bunch of random toys in the set that are artifact creatures because of that, and a couple of scarecrows that you can kill with this spell. Changing the target of a removal spell means that you spent your card, and now your opponent's removal spell is killing their guy, so they are down their removal spell and their creature. And that is only 2 mana, so that is way better than just countering the spell. And up to 2 target creatures can't block this turn is a good way to push in damage. So this card is incredibly versatile, and that's a whole lot of different things it can be doing to mess you up. Changing the target on your spell is probably the biggest one, but being able to kill your artifact creature or your powerful artifact, or being able to make 2 of your guys unable to block, is the kind of versatility that you need to be aware of, because this thing is going to get played, especially in the first couple of weeks while people figure out if it's actually as good as it looks like it is. I think it's going to be close enough. And I think you're going to be seeing this a lot if you're playing against red decks in the format. So just be aware that they might be able to change the target of your removal spell, and that instead of killing their guy and winning combat and maybe even killing them, you're going to suddenly be way on the back foot if your guy dies mid-combat because you tried to use your removal spell on one of their things. And our last red card, I believe, is Violent Eruption. Or, I'm sorry, not Eruption, Violent Urge. Sorry. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains first strike. So this is a very common trick. Across Magic, the 1 mana gets +1 power and first strike shows up in a lot of sets. It does have Delirium, though, and if you have Delirium, the creature gains double strike until end of turn. So, it goes from +1 power and first strike to +1 power and double strike. This is one of those cards that potentially ends the game when you draw it late, and is a decent combat trick early. So, in order to play around this one, you want to make sure your creature has at least 2 toughness more than the power of their creature, which means that you could be running into the +3 power and they get a manifest instead. But that's probably better to trade for their medium guy with your medium guy and their trick and let them have the 2/2 than it is to have your creature get eaten by this thing. The only benefit to having your creature getting eaten by this thing is that they then don't have it for the mid to late game when they have Delirium, and they could probably just win the game with an unblocked creature. Because +1 power and double strike, you don't need to get through with a lot for this thing to randomly kill somebody. And that's assuming that it doesn't naturally have trample. So, yeah, be aware of this. There is a potential 1 mana
+1 power double strike trick in the set. You just need to be aware of if they have delirium or not. Arena, it's a lot easier to keep track of, but just be aware of what's in your opponent's graveyard. And you are allowed to ask to look, especially in sets like this. Like, you're always allowed to ask to see the graveyard. But in sets like these, you have to be extra aware of what's in your opponent's graveyard because of delirium. Alright, that brings us to green, and our first card is Break Down the Door. So, this is the naturalize of the set. So it's green and 2. It can exile an artifact, it can exile an enchantment. You get the exile effect for the extra mana that you're spending. Or you can manifest Dread. So not only can this thing be a powerful removal spell in this set, it can also randomly be a 3 mana 2/2 at instant speed. So a Grey Ogre with Flash. That might later turn into something better. So, like I said before, there are a lot of enchantment creatures, because that's a sub-theme of the set, is the eerie thing, and having enchantments in play, plus all of the rooms. And then there are artifact creatures to help with delirium, so there are going to be valid targets for that. And it can also just throw a 2/2 in your way if your creature is neither an artifact nor an enchantment, and it kind of needs to die mid-combat. So I have to believe that this thing is going to see play. There are too many artifact and enchantment creatures in the set, plus too many value, if it stays in play, rooms. Also, there's always the threat of the early effect of the room coming down and getting them what they need now, and the late game effect of the room threatening to activate as soon as they have enough mana. Like the black one that just brings back all their dead creatures for 8 mana. Like, you need a way to get rid of something like that, or you need to win the game before they get to their 8 mana and get all of their dead stuff back. So, you are going to see this thing a lot. There's going to be valid targets for it. I'm willing to bet every game. Like, it's going to be hard to build a deck that does not have anything for this, and that just means it's a Grey Ogre with Flash. That can be upgraded later, maybe. Like, that's way too versatile, so you need to be aware of this thing, like all removal spells, but it can also randomly be a 2/2 if you don't have a valid target for it, or if none of your targets are great, or if you're attacking with, like, a survivor that has a really potent effect and has 2 toughness. Like, it might just spring out and kill them. If that's the best they can do there. Because there are a few survivors that can spiral out of control if they're not stopped. Like this one down here that just starts churning out free 2/2s by manifesting Dread every time it survives. Yeah, you can't afford to just sit around and not interact with something like that, so they will occasionally use their thing to make a guy to block your guy. Alright. So green doesn't have a ton. Like, green has literally 3 cards that are instants or have flash. Frantic Strength is one of those cards that I lose to a lot. So the way I usually try to beat players with combat tricks is to put them in a position where they're using the combat trick to win combat against a card that I don't mind losing. Like, if I can get you to save your 2/2 from being in combat with my 2/2 by spending your combat trick, I usually consider that a win, because if the combat trick is good enough, it would have let your 3-drop kill my 5-drop later on. Or even your 2-drop kill my 3 or 4-drop later on. So I'm usually okay with trading my guy for the trick in the early game. This punishes that so hard. Like, their creature gets better, it kills my guy, they deal trample damage to me, and then their creature is still better on the later turns. Like, their 2-drop is a 4/4. And that's going to be really hard for me to beat later on, and I'm going to have been 2-for-1 by it, because I'm probably trading another creature that's a much better creature for their 2/2 and their combat trick. So these are pretty brutal if you walk into them. So be aware of it. Like I said, fortunately green does not have a lot of combat tricks or instants in general. So if you're worried it's a green thing, it's probably this, and if it's not, it's probably the next card. Because those are their 2 options, or it has to be something in their other colors.
So be aware of this thing. Don't wander into the giant growth, because the giant growth is way worse in this set for you than normal. It does cost 3 mana though, so you don't have to worry about it until they're on 3, but that might be the thing that they're planning on casting, so maybe just take the hit early on and attack them back, or make them deploy their other 3-drop. Or best case scenario, they just cast it on their guy and deal you an extra 2 points of damage, and now it didn't get to eat your thing, and later on when you trade for it, it's a 2-for-1 in your favor. Last green card is Horrid Vigor. So, target creature gains Death Touch and Indestructible until end of turn. This lets them trade their trick for your guy basically every single time in combat. It makes double blocking a lot more painful. And it makes blocking a Trampler a lot more painful. So be aware of all of those when you're trying to decide if you should block or not, with Horrid Vigor being in the set. But that is the totality of Green's ways to interact at instant speed. So 3 really good ones, but none of them are there's no bad ones, so you don't have to try and guess that it's only the +1/+3 and untap it now. It's like, no, if it's a green combat trick, it's going to be one of these 3. So I mean, technically the first one plays more like removal than a trick, but that's still where you're at, is with all of them being instant speed and pretty good. But that also means you walk into them a lot less, because now you're expecting one of the really good ones. And it's just a question of which one. Alright, so for our multicolored spells down here in gold, we have Drag to the Roots. So it's a 4-drop instant that destroys a non-land permanent. So very similar to like Mortality Spear or Atomize. This one gets its special bonus from Delirium, and it costs 2 less to cast. It's a removal spell, and it can kill any non-land permanent, so if your enchantment suddenly wandering off in the middle of combat was going to wreck you, this is another way to kill an enchantment in black-green, so now they have 3 different potential ways. So just be aware of that, and then you can decide if you need to risk it or not. But if you know they can have any of those 3 different cards, they're all uncommons, but there are 3 of them. So now you know, maybe don't risk getting the enchantment blown up in the middle of combat and losing all my stuff, and not winning the game, and then losing the game because of that. Growing Dread is an enchantment with flash. It's blue and green, and it manifests Dread, so it's essentially a 2-mana 2/2 with flash, with the added benefit of if the opponent can afford to turn the creature face up, it will get a 1/1 counter, and so will any other creature that they can turn face up. There's nothing that turns face up for free, like there's no morph creatures in this set, so the Manifest Dread can only hit other creatures, and none of them, there's no creature in the set that's like, oh, and by the way, I randomly turn face up for free if I'm face down, and it's on you to realize that Manifest Dread is in the set, and that's what the gimmick is. Yeah, there's nothing like that as far as I remember. So it's more just that they can pay to turn their guy's face up. But if their guy is cheap, if their guy is a 2-mana thing and they play this on 4 in the middle of combat, their guy might be getting a 1/1 counter. It's kind of hard to play around all of that. You know, first you have to assume that they're going to flash this in, and then that it's going to work as a pump spell on their guy. So it's something to be aware of, but it's more to be aware of that they could suddenly have a 2/2 in the middle of combat, and then they'll have an enchantment that's buffing their other guys later on. Growing Dread. Here past the Veil is next. So this one is just straight up a card draw spell in red-green of all colors combinations. So again, it's just being aware that the opponent can do this. So it's 4 mana, they discard their hand and draw X cards, where X is the number of card types among cards in their graveyard. So they might suddenly be able to draw like anywhere between 3 and 5 cards reasonably with this thing, and sometimes more than that unreasonably. Like, Kaido's the only planeswalker, so it's going to be kind of hard. Like, artifacts, enchantments, lands, instants, and sorceries are the ones you're most likely to get.
there's no battles, and Kaido's the only planeswalker, so those are unlikely hits, but yeah, they're probably drawing 3 to 5 cards. Probably drawing 3, maybe 4, super rare case 5. Then we have Restricted Office, as I said, so if we tilt our head sideways, this is the white room that is a Wrath on the white side, and then has a blue side, but the white side, your opponent does not have to be running blue. They can still cast this. So when you unlock this room, you destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater. So the opponent knows that this is coming, so they don't have to deploy large creatures, but because they're going to be deploying all of their small creatures, it might disguise the fact to you that they have a Wrath. Normally players don't overcommit into their own Wrath, but if all of their creatures aren't getting killed by this, then they have every incentive in the world to keep deploying their creatures with the idea that they're going to play this room and kill all of your large creatures and then be able to attack you with all of their medium-sized creatures safely after killing like the stuff that you've invested a lot of mana into. So you do have to be aware of this thing. Especially if you have like very efficient creatures that have like 3 power for only 2 to 3 mana. They might be running into this thing. And after that we have 1 artifact, which is the Bear Trap. So it's 1 mana, it has flash, and for 3 additional mana and sacrificing it and tapping it, it deals 3 damage to target creature. So it's 4 mana, colorless, deal 3 damage to target creature. So it's a lot like Red's removal, except way less efficient. So those are all the instants, spells with flash, and combat, and not combat tricks. Those are included in those other spells, and wraths in the format. So I hope this helps you for your pre-release. If you know they exist and what their casting costs are and what they can potentially do, you know what your opponent is capable of doing and how they can mess up your plans. So it gives you the ability to play around them properly, or at least make informed decisions if you have to guess which one of them you're playing around. It's like, do I play around the cheaper one that does a little bit of damage, or the more expensive one that does a lot of damage? Like, do I attack with these creatures or those creatures? At least now you know why you're doing it and whether or not you should be doing it, and can make that informed decision, which means that you'll win a lot more games than you would if you did not know what was coming. So I hope this helps you at your pre-release, and I wish you good luck. I know it's helped me in my pre-releases, and I will see you next time. Have a good rest of your day.